Greetings, Life Group leaders. This is our last lesson in Mark. As we study Mark 15 and 16 today, I hope that you're ready to end on a high because this is a great overview of the gospel message. Our study guide has a great application for our passage this week, particularly in the leaders section in the back that starts on page 157. It's got great learning readiness activities. It's got great transitions. So this week I'm just going to parallel that and maybe highlight a couple of things that they don't highlight. But we're going to begin our lesson this week by looking backwards because we got to know where our passage is in context. So I'm going to look at Mark 14, like 53 through 15:25. Jesus was crucified following a night and a morning of torture and ridicule. And then for 6 hours he hung on the cross. The mockery continued. And then in 15:26 through 32, the land went dark for 3 hours as Jesus was nearing death. And then Jesus quotes Psalm 22, verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then we see the continuation of the mocking, but then Mark notes there is one gesture of sympathy to Jesus, the offering of the sponge soaked in sour wine. Finally, Jesus cries out with a loud voice and breathes his last. The veil in the temple, separating the holy place from the most holy place, is torn in two from top to bottom. And this is probably a symbol of the old covenant ending and the beginning of a new covenant, that God would no longer reside in a place, but reside within his people. Then a Roman centurion observed the way that Jesus died and confesses his faith. He says, "Truly, this man is the Son of God." And then finally, Mark tells us that, quote, some women were there watching from a distance. They had been followers of Jesus and they had cared for him while he was in Galilee. So that's the overview of where we came from. And our passage begins this week with Jesus dead, his body mauled as it's hanging on a cross. Mark says, when evening had come, and when he means evening, he probably means late afternoon. It's probably about 4:30. Jesus died on Friday, the day of preparation, and the Jewish Sabbath began at sundown. Time was running out to entomb Jesus' body before his followers would be breaking religious law. Mark took special care to outline these Jewish customs for his Gentile readers. But for the worst thought for all of Jesus' followers would not be breaking religious law, but the thought of leaving Jesus' body to hang naked and exposed for 2 days. Something needed to be done and done quickly. Joseph of Arimathea made a request to Pilate for Jesus' body. Mark tells us several interesting facts about Joseph. One, he was from Arimathea, which is a small town northwest of Jerusalem, but it's also the birthplace of Samuel, the prophet and judge in the Old Testament. Joseph is identified as an honored member of the Sanhedrin, or the High Council. This body, composed of mostly prominent Jewish religious leaders, exercised considerable authority over Jewish life under the Roman governor, of course. Thus, Joseph was a prominent figure in Judea during the time of Jesus. Given the fact that he owned a grave that was so near to the capital and he was willing to use it for Jesus' burial, Joseph was probably a man of considerable wealth, in addition to having power and influence. Mark also tells us in verse 43 that Joseph was waiting for the kingdom of God to come. This suggests that he probably was not a Sadducee, since Sadducees did not have expectations for a future kingdom nor of the afterlife. Joseph could have been a Pharisee, but this isn't stated in the text. In verse 43, it says that Joseph took a risk and went to Pilate. And this risk was actually double-edged. On one hand, by going to Pilate and asking for the body of Jesus, Joseph could have been identified as a follower of Jesus who was just convicted and sentenced as a treasonous usurper. It could well jeopardize his leadership. It could well jeopardize his own life. On the other hand, by going to Pilate and asking for the body of Jesus, Joseph surely risked criticism or even ostracism from other members of the High Council. Mark doesn't tell us why Joseph asked to bury the body of Jesus, but Matthew fills us in here in chapter 27 of his gospel by identifying Joseph as a follower of Jesus. But Joseph may have also been motivated by the Jewish tradition of honoring the dead by burying them. Romans did not bury victims of crucifixion as a way of adding insult to injury and using their death as a threat to other would-be lawbreakers. When Joseph arrived and requested the body of Jesus, Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. It often took several days, up to a week, to die from the weakness, fatigue, dehydration, and suffocation that's caused by crucifixion. The Romans did not design crucifixion to be a quick death. Once the death was confirmed by the centurion, Christ's body was released. Now you might be asking how all of this could happen before the sun went down if it already started at, as we said, around 4:30. The palace, the Antonia fortress where Pilate lived when he was in Jerusalem, was only about 600 yards from Golgotha, so it could definitely be done, especially if you were in a hurry because you were pressed for time. It was also unusual to give the corpse of a person condemned for treason to anyone but a close family member. Consequently, Pilate's willingness to give Jesus' body to Joseph suggests that he did not really believe that Jesus was guilty of treason. Another interesting tidbit in this verse is that this is the only place in the New Testament that Jesus' body is identified as a corpse. Mark uses the word to further stress the reality that Jesus is dead. The body was taken off the cross and wrapped in fine linen, and then it was laid in a new tomb or a cave. A stone was rolled against the door of the tomb, and this was fairly typical in the area surrounding Jerusalem, as it's a dry, mountainous, rocky terrain. It would just be incredibly difficult to dig a grave. So bodies were often placed into tombs, and then because there's a limited number of tombs in the area, the tombs were often shared. And so what would happen is after decay set in, the bones of the people buried in the tomb would then be collected and placed into boxes, and then the box would be left in the tomb. These bone boxes were called ossuaries, and it's very common to find them in places where graves aren't dug, but people are entombed in caves. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joses, observed where he was laid, and then it is implied that they left and rested on the Sabbath. There are a lot of details that we might be saying, so what? Who cares how Jesus was buried? But the burial of Jesus was an important part of the preaching of the early church. It forms a connection between Jesus' death and his resurrection, and most importantly, it proves the reality of Jesus' death. And so now we begin chapter 16. After Jesus was buried, his body lay in the tomb until early Sunday morning. The women went to anoint Jesus' corpse with spices. They evidently knew nothing about the sealing of the tomb or the posting of the guard there, as Matthew tells us in chapter 27. These women simply wanted to honor Jesus by making his corpse as pleasant smelling as possible. Maybe they were encouraged by Mary of Bethany's example from what we studied last week, that they wanted to make a sacrifice for him. Obviously, they didn't understand that Jesus would rise from the dead. And they do this because the Jews did not practice embalming. The women came to the tomb to anoint his body primarily to mask the scent of decay. Even though there was a stone rolled in front of the tomb, things could get pretty ripe. It's hot and dry in the desert, and it takes a long time for things to rot. So this was a common practice of perfuming and putting scented oils to anoint a recently deceased body. They came across the tomb as the sun was rising, and the women were concerned about access to the tomb. It had been sealed with a large stone, but as they arrived at the tomb, the stone had been rolled away. There was no question that they went to the right tomb on Sunday morning, since they had been there Friday afternoon. Once again, Mark is guarding against any wrong conclusion that the disciples were mistaken about the resurrection of Jesus. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man, clothed in a long white robe. He appeared to be a youth, but his strength and his unusual address indicated that he was an angel. You can go back to Mark chapter 9 at the Transfiguration and see that white clothing indicates something supernatural and divine is happening. So this would indicate that this man is more than just a man, but is in fact a messenger from the Lord. They were alarmed, and yet the angel sought to calm their fears. His message to the women had 4 points. 1, You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. 2. See the place where they laid him. 3. But go and tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he is going before you into Galilee. Now, this is just speculation, but I believe the reason why the angel singled Peter out was that Peter, above all of the disciples, especially needed to hear this good news in view of his triple denial of Jesus and his consequent despair. Mark only records this special reference to Peter probably because it meant so much to Peter. Most scholars believe that Peter was one of the primary sources for Mark's gospel. And then the angel's fourth point is this: there you will see him in Galilee as he had said to you. Jesus predicted the scattering of his sheep and their regathering in Galilee in chapter 14 of Mark. Galilee was the appropriate place to launch the new worldwide mission to the Gentiles as well as to the Jews. He called his disciples to be fishers of men in Galilee in chapter 1, and now he would be commissioning them to be shepherds of the sheep there. Finally, Mark tells us that the women left amazed and afraid. The women were so upset by what had happened that when they left the tomb, they told no one about what they had seen at first. However, it wasn't long before they were spreading the news that Jesus was alive again. One commentary I read said this: the ending of Mark punctures any self-confident superiority the reader might feel, for the ending turns irony back upon the reader. Throughout the story, when Jesus commanded people to be quiet, they talked anyway. But at the end, when the angel commands the women to go and tell the message, the crucial message, Jesus is risen, in an ironic reversal, they are silent. The fear of the women dominates the ending of the story. At this point, fear forces the reader to face once again the fears in his or her own situation. No matter how much the reader knows or sees, he or she must still make the hard choice in the end, whether to be silent, like the women, or to proclaim the good news in face of persecution and possibly death. So that concludes our study of the Gospel of Mark, which in its very essence is a message of hope. And I want to end our study of Mark with this beautiful quote from Paul Tripp. I say that because even this week, God has used this statement to just speak to me in a time of discouragement. He says this: the most horrible thing that ever happened was the most wonderful thing that ever happened. Be careful how you make sense of your life. What looks like a disaster may in fact be grace. What looks like the end may be the start of something new and beautiful. And so pass that along to your class, and maybe it will give them hope and encouragement in a dark and difficult situation that they're facing in their life. And I'll conclude this week with some questions for you to help your group find community and do that through the process of belonging, find a place where they belong, finding and discovering what God's Word by believing what it says and who Jesus Christ is, and then by becoming who God made them to be. And so our first couple of questions are belong question. Number 1, He has risen, He is not here, is perhaps the most hope-filled, joy-filled, space and time-altering statements in the history of the universe. No hyperbole there. Why? How has the truth of the resurrection impacted you personally? Belong question number 2. Jesus predicted his own resurrection many times. His followers knew these predictions well. Yet the women were still approaching the tomb as though they thought he would be in it. Are there any promises that God has made to you which you've lacked confidence or faith in? Are there any areas of your life that reflect unbelief in what God said he will do? Now I have a couple of believe questions. Going back to our previous question, Jesus shared repeatedly that he would rise from the dead on the third day, but the women didn't seem to understand this, even when they found an open tomb. When have you forgotten a lesson that God clearly showed you? How did he remind you of that truth? Believe question number 2, which I apologize, it has kind of a setup statement to it, so it's not really a question until the very end. But even in their unbelief that he would be raised from the dead, Mary Magdalene and Salome were faithful to love and worship Jesus, bringing spices to anoint his dead body. They were the last at the crucifixion, and they were first at the tomb. And because they showed up, they discovered that he had been telling the truth all along, and were the very first people to hear the news of the resurrection. They became believers of the resurrection when they met the man in white. What does it look like for you to love Jesus and to worship him in spite of unbelief and in spite of uncertainty? What does it look like for us to continue showing up even when we are disappointed that things haven't turned out the way that we hoped that they would? And finally, our Become questions, which will help us as a class to grow together and be God's people. What grief or fear are you experiencing right now? How can the truth of Jesus' resurrection guide you through this experience? How can we as a class help you with dealing with grief or fear? And then the final question, class, is never assume that just because somebody's a regular attender of church, that they are in fact a gospel-believing follower of Christ. This may be the best opportunity you've had in a while to share the gospel briefly with your class. Jesus suffered and died for you so that you could know him and that you could know the peace, the hope, the joy, the love that he brings us, and that we would have contentment and an abundant life, not just in eternity, but here and now. Have you ever considered what would happen to you if you died today? Would you know for certain where you would be? And then go in and explain the truth of the gospel to your class. Well, that's all that I've got for you today, and I just hope that you have a blessed Memorial Day weekend, and that God would use you to speak the truths that your group needs to hear this week, praying that you have a great life group this holiday weekend. If you need anything, please let me know. Godspeed.